Whoa. I hit the wrong button. All right, everybody. We are back. I got the music back. Got the new studio set up going. Things are looking good. I got Michael Millerman here with me. It is Jack Murphy. This is Jack Murphy Live Show. Got a special guest today, Michael Millerman, doing a return appearance. A wonderful man, a great philosopher, and a lot of fun to talk to. We are going to get into it. His book is Beginning with Heidegger. We are going to talk about that title, what it means, and what it means for philosophy. But before we do that, Michael, let's just check in a little bit, buddy. How you doing today, man? It's good to see you. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. Yeah, I'm doing really well. It's good to be with you. I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk the first time around. From what I understand, people were interested enough in the topic of Dugin's fourth political theory for you to bring the man himself onto the show, which was great.
Yeah,
and by the way,
awesome.
Let me just give you the kudos because that was such a good interview. You brought out so many new pieces of information about how he thinks about America and how he thinks about geopolitics. And I think people got to see a side of him that they may not have known otherwise, that I've been sort of arguing for a long time, that he's a real thinker, a serious thinker, a smart man, an interesting guy and worth listening to. So again, good for you for having him on and doing a good job with him.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate that. You know, that whole sort of thread started with you talking to you about Dugin. And then I interviewed Benjamin Teitelbaum, and he did his book on Dugin. And then I just reached out to Dugin, and what do you know? He said yes. So it was great to have that conversation. Let's do a little bit of introductions. I'm Jack Murphy. You can find me at Jack Murphy Live on Twitter, on YouTube, /Jack Murphy Live, Jack Murphy Live everywhere. I wrote a book. It's called Democrat to the Plurable. You should get it. And if you're interested in masculinity, sovereignty, and brotherhood, come down, check out the Liminal Order at liminal-order.com. Michael, what have you been up to? What are you working on? Where can people find you? What are things going on? You got courses? What are you doing these days?
Well, people can find me at michaelmillerman.ca. That's where I post my videos, articles, essays, interviews, talking to people most of the time about philosophy, political theory, how to think deeply about ideologies, about what it means to be human and the best life, the best political order. These are the things that I like to study and teach, write about. So I'm doing a lot of tutoring, a lot of one-on-one private tutoring. I'm also teaching a 8-week course on the philosophy of Leo Strauss right now. If anybody wants to check that out, it's otherlife.co/Strauss. That's in partnership with Justin Murphy. Some of the listeners may know, may not know, also a scholar who did some work on Deleuze and others. So we're working on this Strauss course. It's going really well. Just had our first session. And it's a privilege for me because I love Leo Strauss. I think that he's an amazing teacher, the gold standard. I think his books on thinking through the nature of political life are just indispensable for anybody who wants to get beneath the surface of these things. So as I say, it's a real privilege for me to be teaching about him. But I'm also doing courses on Heidegger, on some people that your listeners may or may not be familiar with, guys like Alexander Kovev, who wrote about the end of history on the basis of an understanding of Hegel. So these are maybe not so familiar to your average, ordinary, everyday, intelligent person who follows contemporary politics and things like that, but they're definitely big hitters on the intellectual plane whose teachings and lectures really forced people to think about what it means if history is progressive. Does it culminate in a certain end of history type moment? So I'm teaching all of these books privately. I'm out of academia, as you know, and some of your listeners may know. I was sort of blacklisted, put out of academia, but my independent teaching is going well and really making me happy. And the students seem to enjoy it.
I think what you're doing,
pretty much what I'm doing.
I think it's the future, man. Bespoke education. I have taken one of your courses and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm taking another course with Joe Norman right now. And it's the future. You know, you don't have to go to university and pay all that ridiculous money to get classes that you don't really want in an environment that you can't stand. No, just go directly to the people that have the knowledge. And it's a beautiful thing. It's more intimate. There's a greater attention to the students and a lot more interaction. And it's on your time. And I highly recommend it. Check out Michael's classes in conjunction with Justin Murphy. And please do check it out because it's super high quality. And you're going to find that out today because we're going to talk about Michael's book. Let's see if we can pull it up here a little bit. There we go. Beginning with Heidegger, Strauss, Rorty, Derrida, Dugin, and the philosophical constitution of the political. Now, Michael, last time that we did something like this, we called it Dugin for Dummies. And we called it that because I didn't really know anything about Dugin and I wanted you to talk me through it. I hadn't read too much of his work, and it was our conversation served as a real nice introduction for people. So I kind of want to take a little bit of this same approach. I did read the book and I do have an understanding of the arguments, but I got to tell you, man, some of this stuff was a little hard for me to understand. So why don't we just walk through it? That's what I want to do. I've got a bunch of questions and an outline here. And, a good place to start as any is just, how, beginning, first of all, that word, I think in your use has a number of meanings here. So let's begin with the beginning. And tell me, why and how did this book come to be? Like, what were you doing? One day you were sitting around and you're like, all right, I'm going to write this book beginning with Heidegger. How did that happen? What was the genesis?
So for about a 10-year period, I was in academia doing my undergraduate, then my master's, then my graduate. So this comes out of my academic context, out of my academic work. But I think it's helpful if I sort of walk you through exactly what the motivation of the problem was here. So there are a few pieces that come together. Let me just build the blocks. One of my first questions as an undergraduate that sort of sunk into my soul and wouldn't let me go was this. What is the relationship between how we think about political life? So we're all roughly aware of what it means to think about political life. You have political parties, countries, nations, constitutions, laws, and all of that. That's pretty much within the purview of your ordinary citizen. But what's the connection between that and metaphysics, ontology, first philosophy, our deepest fundamental ideas about what it is to be a human being? Is the human being created or evolved? Was the universe made or is it eternal? What is the nature of the human soul if there is one? Does it make sense to think about a hierarchy of the soul or not? And how do these things relate to our ordinary notions of politics? So it's not obvious that they do. If you were to ask somebody who has a strong opinion about political parties or just again who reads follows the daily news, and you were to ask them, well, what do you think about the relationship between being and time and how that relates to your political opinions? That would probably be a bridge too far. But what I discovered, especially reading Leo Strauss, he was my main entry point into this kind of thinking, is that in fact you can connect the dots between those two levels and see that somehow our ordinary politics passes through an understanding of ideology, which is somehow more abstract, more theoretical, more philosophical. But the ideology itself is a pale reflection or shadow of a deeper set of fundamental philosophical arguments. And that became my main region of study. Heidegger comes to the table in a couple of ways here. The first one is that every serious 20th century political philosopher recognized Heidegger's eminence as a thinker. Everybody said, this guy is in a league of his own. He's giving us something that's absolutely crucial, something that we haven't had the likes of in hundreds of years. I mean, a philosophy that is this profound. And therefore, they were forced in thinking about politics and philosophy to pass through the question of Heidegger. But they come out the other end of it in very different ways, in very different directions. So I think that most Americans would know Heidegger through the way that he's reflected in deconstructionist French postmodern thinking, all of which is hugely indebted to Heidegger, but definitely drives him in a certain direction that is not the only one that his students went into. So there was a time as a student when I was doing two things at the same time. I was taking a class on leftist thinkers who were heavily influenced by Heidegger, and I was translating Alexander Dugin's first Heidegger book. Okay? And I saw, as I put these two things together, that here you have Heidegger in the center of two hugely important ideological and philosophical alternatives, and yet they're so different at the end of that process. And I wanted to make sense of that. How do they read Heidegger differently? Why do they read him differently? In what way were the French thinkers projecting anti-Nazism or leftism or liberalism onto their reading of Heidegger and then missing some core of his philosophical argumentation? You see, what way was the philosophy being distorted by a pre-existing political prejudice? And how would it be possible sort of to go from the direction of Heidegger down to the ideologies, and at the same time, like I put it in the book, The Candle Burning at Both Ends, from the ideologies back up to Heidegger, and sort of triangulate and see what, when we put these different receptions, these different geopolitical receptions of Heidegger together, including the French one, including Dugin's Russian reception, including Leo Strauss, who is hugely indebted to Heidegger, Richard Rorty, an American social democrat thinker who also expressed his indebtedness to Heidegger. What happens when we see what's the source of the divergence in the interpretation of Heidegger? Is it that he just is an open book and you can take him whichever direction you want? Is it that there was an ideological or political motive? What's going on? So that's the task that I set for myself. And again, there are a lot of different pieces of this puzzle, but one thing that was obvious to me before I started working on Dugin, and as I started working on Dugin, as someone who has a reception of Heidegger different from the prevailing one, like the deconstructionist leftist one, was that, look, we obviously have missed something super important. Western intellectualism is missing something potentially all important, potentially of decisive importance, something that Heidegger showed us philosophically, that because of the geopolitical circumstances of the 20th century, threw out the baby with the bathwater. You're rejecting Nazism. The Western world is rejecting right-wing anti-liberalism out of the fear that it leads to genocidal Holocaust mania or something like that. And is it possible that in doing so, they overstepped the bounds of their legitimate reach and accidentally got rid of some priceless philosophical reflections at the same time? Well, how would we know that? Only if we were willing to go sort through the debris in some sense and sort it out. Well, that requires a little bit of patience, a little bit of tolerance. Like I put it when I was trying to make sense of why nobody else was into this quite the way that I was. You have to have a high tolerance for cases of mixed merit, because when you're sorting through the debris, there's going to be some legitimate, I'm not going to swear on the channel, there's going to be some things that you don't necessarily want to poke your nose into, but at the same time, you might have that pearl of great price there. And anybody who loves philosophy, who thinks that philosophy is all important, or who defends freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and therefore the dignity of the human mind, would be disgusted at the thought that there's something priceless that we've left behind that we therefore must recover. So that was sort of like the motivation, the intention, the genesis of the project, and why I wanted to put people from across the political spectrum. Dugin, somehow let's call him roughly to the right. Derrida, let's call him roughly to the left. Rorty, a somewhat leftist social democrat. Strauss, somewhat right-leaning critic of, roughly, right? People across the political spectrum get to Heidegger that way, try to get as much as we can on the table to recover that pearl of great price. So that was the project, and Heidegger's the key. He's the key for all of them because he's the 20th century's most outstanding thinker.
Why do you think no one had taken this task on yet? Why was this a question as of yet unanswered? And maybe for some of the folks who are less familiar with Heidegger, maybe you could put that into context. Like, why was it something that people might have shied away from, or why was this opening still here in the philosophical, sort of lineage?
So the simplest thing to say about Heidegger is that on one hand, he was recognized as the absolutely most outstanding thinker. His 1927 book, Being and Time, some of you may have heard about, or certainly would. You're familiar with second and third level reflections of his ideas because they seeped their way into popular intellectual culture and popular culture and things like that. But he had a sort of philosophical revolution. But on May 1st, 1933, he also joined the Nazi Party. He made some speeches about the reform of the universities when he became a rector of Freiburg University. And he never famously, apologized or repented over or expressed any contrition about his affiliation with the Nazis, his support, whatever the exact nature of it was. So a lot of times, that's the easiest dichotomy right there, right? Great thinker, but he's a Nazi. And if you take him too seriously, you too will become a Nazi. There were people who thought that about Leo Strauss, because Strauss, in his early 30s, wrote a letter that was published, I think, 2001. Or so, where he said to his friend, look, we can't crawl back to the cross of liberalism. Just because Hitler wants to kill the Jews doesn't mean that the principles of the right are not the true principles, imperial, fascistic, and authoritarian. So people dug out that letter and they're like, okay, you have an interest in Strauss, you go to the fascist pile. You have an interest in Heidegger, you go to the Nazi pile, right? And everything gets sorted out in its proper place. On the other hand, if you have an interest in all the other theories that you know are very popular in academia today and your listeners know are very popular in academia today, you're fine. You know, if you want to do all of those topics, that's okay. But if you want to study the most serious philosopher in the last numerous hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, well, you can't draw those distinctions. You're just tainted. So one of the reasons I think people they didn't raise the question the way that I had in mind. What part of Heidegger do we leave out when we interpret him in terms of the 20th century political history and his affiliation with Nazism? Is because, like I said, it brings them too close to those uncharted territories. They're going to have the guilt by association of even wanting to look there, and I didn't mind, because you have to do it. If you think that what you're searching for is valuable, then you'll go through hell and high water to get it. And if you don't, if somebody doesn't, then it shows you that what they say is valuable is just they're just empty talk, cheap talk, right? So all of the people around me who claimed that political philosophy is the most important way of life, that the philosophical life is the best way of life, who didn't want to raise this question, or who really drilled down on me when I tried to pursue it this way, they just showed that they don't care about what they say they care about. But again, my personal history is something separate here. The issue itself is what's really important. So Dugin was reading Heidegger in a way that I think was unfamiliar to most people in the English language, in English-speaking scholarship. He had written 4 books about Heidegger. He'd said that Martin Heidegger's philosophy is the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory. He identified a key notion in Heidegger's thought as being of central importance to his own thinking. And his first book on Heidegger, let me try to state this in a way that won't be impenetrable. So let's say there are 2 key aspects to Heidegger's thought. One is that he looks back over the history of philosophy, and he shows that it's been a series of distorted interpretations of some basic fundamental insight or event that happened at the beginning. So at the beginning, the first thinkers, they expose themselves to the sort of breakthrough event of proximity to being itself. They raise the question of the meaning of being, what it means to be, what it is, what being is. Okay, I'm giving you a rough shod overview here. That happens at the beginning of philosophy, and gradually there are a series of distorted interpretations of that basic event. And those distorted interpretations become the handed down and inherited tradition of conceptual thought. So that if anybody tries to understand themselves and their situation in the history of philosophy, they have recourse to this tradition which distorts and blocks access to the underlying initial breakthrough moment. Now, Heidegger said, I will show you the sense in which the whole of the past philosophy as we know it has depended on this tradition of distorted interpretation. That's part A. And part B is, through my thinking, I will inaugurate once again another beginning or another inception of philosophy. I will drive us back down to that original wellspring where being itself discloses itself past these distorted interpretations and inaugurate a new future for philosophy, another beginning of philosophy. As a rule, the leftist thinkers, they take the first part of his reasoning, that I'm going to show you how the interpretations of the history of philosophy are distorted, and therefore they can relativize or deconstruct or undo all of the capital letter conceptual reasoning that they think is reactionary. Like if you talk about nature with a capital N, or essence with a capital E, or truth with a capital T, they can tell you all of that is a construct, none of that is real, okay? You're sort of misled by essentialism. So they go half the way with Heidegger. But when it comes to inaugurating another beginning of philosophy, out of their concern that this is going to mean reactionary Nazism and all of the things that they're trying to get away from, they just leave that off to the side. And Dugin, he didn't have that same problem, for example. And so his first philosophy book is called, his first Heidegger book is called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning. So this idea of another beginning of philosophy is front and center for Dugin in a way that it's not even on the agenda, on the intellectual agenda for so many of the leftist readers of Heidegger. Now, there are other figures who, for other reasons, didn't go along with Heidegger, and I wanted to try to understand what were their reasons. Are they primarily philosophical? Do they have a refutation of his account of the history of philosophy? Do they offer a sound and viable intellectual alternative? Or are they just concerned, which, by the way, I'm not diminishing the validity of this concern, that his thought leads us politically to immoderation, to a lack of standards of judgment, and potentially leads us somehow morally astray, even though it may be somehow intellectually profound, astute, or right. You know, that's a puzzle. And that's the puzzle I was trying to work through.
You know, at first blush, and I'm sure we're going to get into this a little bit more, if I remember from the readings and I remember from Dugin and such, you know, if you go along, and we're going to get into Heidegger's notions in a second, but if you go along with them and you believe in them, it does take a pretty deep cut at universal liberalism. Yeah. So like I can see how people would want to reject that, who take universal liberalism to be gospel. It's like it's settled. It's the end of philosophy, end of history, universal human rights, universal this, universality. You know, he does take a pretty deep cut at that.
Yeah, but look, Leo Strauss, I don't think anybody who studies him well enough and long enough, or just takes my word for it, could ever accuse him of being immoderate. Okay, Leo Strauss was a reincarnation of the Socratic spirit of wisdom and moderation combined. So Strauss is very concerned with moderation, but Strauss himself also recognized, he said that rational liberalism, Heidegger has basically pulled the carpet out from rational liberalism. His exact quote, I wish I had it right at my fingertips. What he said is that we have to make a very great effort today to find a basis, a reasonable basis for liberalism. But here's the big problem. The greatest thinker today is Heidegger. So in other words, liberalism is facing its own crisis independently of Heidegger. It needs our help to remain afloat somehow, to have a basis that's not just arbitrary and distorted from its original rational basis. But there's no great thinker who can provide a rational basis for liberalism, because today's greatest thinker, he said, is, just as you indicated, absolutely tears liberalism down. So that puts us before a very important dilemma. Do we sacrifice what we regard as philosophical wisdom or the truth of things for the sake of a political order that is sound but not true? Or do we say we have to consider revising the political order to make it closer to the truth as we have discovered it through our reasoning and through our philosophizing? There's a fundamental tension, or there may be, between what philosophy requires and what politics requires, or to put it differently, between the truth and morality, or however you want to distinguish those two things. And it's a challenge for everybody who thinks about these kinds of issues, especially for the history of political philosophy. What is the best way, not necessarily of resolving that tension, although there have been attempts to resolve it by saying, let's do a popular enlightenment. If we have a popular enlightenment, if we strive towards universal education of the masses, then we can close the gap between what politics requires and what philosophy teaches. Okay, but as Strauss taught in some of his works, if you want to have a universal education, if you want to have universal enlightenment, among other things, you have to have the technological conquest of nature, because you can't have universal education if you have scarcity. Education requires leisure. If people have to work for their living, they don't have time to read beginning with Heidegger or Strauss or anything else like that. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, and education as a rule was the preserve of the few landowners or wealthy people who have leisure. Okay, so that's fine, not a problem. We'll overcome scarcity by liberating technology and conquering nature. And we'll make sure that our liberation of technology has no moral or political control. It's just in the sake of it's for the sake of popular enlightenment, and we'll have it be in the service of man's ever increasing progressive satisfaction. Well, as it happens, some negative externalities arise when you liberate technology from moral and political control and aim at popular enlightenment. So this whole question of the gap between the philosophical and the political and how you would close it, it comes with all kinds of very serious problems if you begin to think them through, as Strauss did and other people did. So then you're left with this question. Does that mean you have to have, maybe you use religion as a tool of control of the masses? Well, there you have your own questions and problems that arise with that. So acknowledging that the political and the philosophical are not necessarily in harmony with one another. They don't necessarily map onto one another. They may or may not. But we begin with the assumption of a gap between the two, and that's where there's a lot of things to think through. Heidegger definitely drives home the gap between what we take for granted as liberal Democrats, or as people who have inherited a liberal world, and what he has shown is the real baselessness philosophically of the liberal axioms.
maybe we should have backed up just a second and just sort of describe the difference between philosophy and political theory, or philosophy and politics, because I think a lot of us believe in America for sure that like our politics is a direct extension of philosophy. But are these the same thing? Are they different? How are they different? Help us have a frame for that. Just, I don't want to go too deep into this particular subject, but I think it's useful for us moving forward in the conversation.
Okay, there are a few different models for thinking about it. One of the classic ones that you and your listeners may find helpful, I think everybody who encounters it can find it helpful. That's Plato's cave. If you know about Plato's cave allegory, he says, here's our nature with respect to its education. We're like prisoners shackled at the bottom of a cave. We can't move our heads to the left, to the right. We can't move our bodies. All that we see are shadows on the wall. Of course, we don't see them as shadows. We take them as real. But a little bit up behind us, there's a fire burning, and there are people walking with artifacts and other items casting these shadows on the wall. And behind that fire, there's the mouth of the cave that opens out into the sunlight. And it's in principle possible to turn your soul around from the shadows on the wall and to go up and out of the cave to see the natural beings, first as they're reflected in the water, for example, or as they appear in the night, and then finally to look at the sun itself. So here you have a whole process of education that begins from where we are initially, taking some shadows as realities, and then you have the turning around of the soul leaving the cave. How this relates to politics and philosophy in general, a lot of people that I think give valuable commentaries have seen it this way. The cave, among other things, represents our opinions about political life, our opinions about what's good and bad, our opinions about the nature of human life. And those opinions are decisive. They're of decisive importance for the political regime's self-understanding, not only the American one. Every country, every nation, every civilization, every people, in some sense, has its own cave, its own understanding of what the world is, of what things are, and of how to make sense of it. But it's in principle always possible to drive that inquiry a little bit further and to try to get out of the cave of a horizon of opinion out into the truth itself. Now, if you think that the American political regime is just an embodiment of the truth itself, the self-evident truths, well, that may or may not be the case. But at the very least, it forces us to say, well, what is the truth about human life? All men are created equal. Okay, are all men created? What does that imply? What does it mean to say that all men are created equal? What's the circumstances of that utterance? What is implied in a natural law about the eternity of the human soul? Suddenly you scratch beneath the surface and you get into some very big questions. And philosophy is raising and trying to answer those big questions. As my man Leo Strauss put it, okay, in other words, as you and your Strauss for me, as I said, is key here. Here's how he put it in an argument that I think is very good. All political action, whether it is preservation or change, we want to keep things the way that they are. We want to stop them from getting worse, or we want to change them for the better. Okay, overthrow the previous guys. They were schmucks. We want to make it better, right? Or no, leave these guys because the next guys are going to make it worse. So all political action concerns preservation or change. All preservation or change has reference toward better or worse. We want to keep things from getting worse. We want to make them get better. But all thought of better and worse has reference to the good, because you don't know whether something is better unless it's getting you more of the good or closer to the good. You don't know if it's worse unless it's taking you further away from the good. So, okay, all political action implies reference to the good, but as a rule, our attitude towards the good has the status of opinion. We think we know, we opine that it's good for men to be treated equal, or we think we know that ... whatever we think is good, right? More equality, more equity, more control, more authority, stricter laws, looser laws. Whatever we think constitutes progress, in other words, whatever we think is good, has the status of opinion. But we, in principle, could question that opinion. I mean, other people have held other opinions. There are philosophers who argue in a great, not superficially. We're not talking about, I want to convey this. When there's a disagreement among philosophers concerning the idea of the good, about justice, the political life, human life, we're not talking about first-year college students who are like, yo, bro, I think man is not equal. We're talking about some serious thinkers here who adduce incredible conceptual highly focused and concentrated argumentation in support of their view. These are not trivial differences, flippant or lighthearted. And I'll give you an example. Leo Strauss had a debate with Alexander Kovev, who argued in favor of the end of history. He said, look, man is a progressive being, and we are a historical being. We move through a progressive history that takes us more and more into the light, more and more into the truth. At T1, we have more truth and more light than we had at T0. Okay? As time unfolds, truth unfolds. And at some point, this process ends. And when this process ends, you've reached the stage called the end of history. And it has all kinds of implications about politics, about human life, and all of this. Leo Strauss and Alexander Kovev had a debate about these things in a book published in English called On Tyranny. And you see that on one hand, Kovev, so the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to show you that serious people do these arguments and that they lead to very real political consequences. Koyev's position has him defending tyranny. He says tyranny is completely rational in a good way. Tyrants help us have more truth in history. Okay, what the philosopher should help the tyrant somehow to realize through his tyranny what he's trying to do, but only the philosopher can really help him do it. What the tyrant really wants is the same thing all human beings want: universal recognition of his personal honor and dignity, or something like that. So it's sort of like a defense of the tyrant, a justification of tyranny, and sometimes he even says things that are really scandalous in this view, but it's very much related to the philosophical view that truth progresses in time. Strauss, who says that no, being does not unfold in time. Being is eternally self-same. Being is eternally self-identical. He's taking issue here with Hegel and Kovev on the basis of a classical understanding. So on one hand, this thesis about being, and suddenly he's not defending tyranny, he's defending moderation, constitutional order, a mixed regime, the interpretation of the law by sort of a class of decent gentlemen. So you think like, wow, these are two intellectual giants. Jacques, they're way above the level of me and you and anybody who's listening to us. These are not stupid people, okay? And they have a very close connection between philosophy and are we justifying tyranny or not? Do we want a universal globalist world state, a classless world state? Well, you know what that means. No national borders, no boundaries. In fact, no identities at all that could introduce any sense of non-equality. What Strauss wrote in the late 1940s about the implication of this view was that if we continue on a progressivist globalist interpretation of truth in human history, we're going to reach a point where the tyrants, the ruling globalist tyrants, will, and I'm quoting almost verbatim, will command their biologists to deny that there are any natural differences that are not totally compatible with the ideological doctrine of equality. In other words, they will force their scientists to lie about natural differences. Now, when you read that in 2020, even if you don't get all the argumentation about truth, being, time, history, the end of history, you say, wait a minute, they're going to command their scientists to lie about natural differences. Well, that doesn't sound like 1948. That sounds like 2018, 2019, 2020, and things are getting worse. Then I think you stop and scratch your head and say, gosh, what were these guys onto that they could see this then? How are we seeing the living consequences of these abstract principles that they were discussing 60, 70 years ago? That's in some sense the challenge. But all of that implies some opinion about what's good. What is human nature? Is this something that we should try to get away from because it's a limitation of our free, rational, technological development? Therefore, human nature is something to be conquered. Just like, look, I wanted to block out the winds. I put up a wall, right? I want to block out the cold, put in a heater. Now I want to block out the constraints of human nature. Fine, I put in some artificial intelligence nanotechnologies, whatever the case is, right? But it's all for the sake of overcoming nature as a constraint or as a limitation. But Strauss says, hold on. If you're interpreting nature as something bad, as something evil, as a constraint that you need to overcome, including your own human nature, you may have taken a wrong turn somewhere in your intellectual history, because at least the classical teaching in Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Cicero, and many others is that the nature of a thing is its standard. Somehow the best human life is a life that is the perfection of our nature. Nature is not something evil or bad, something that limits our free rationality. Rather, it is in our nature to be rational, and the perfection of our rationality is the perfection of our nature. It's not, those two things are not separate in the sense that one is seen as the enemy to the other. And yet, in the course of history, in the course of intellectual history, our attitude towards nature has changed, therefore towards technology, history, and human life itself. And so we face, at the level of the development of these principles, some hugely significant alternatives. Either, for example, transhumanist, post-humanist, artificial intelligence, technological utopia that wants to put an end to space, time, reality, and human life itself, and it wants to celebrate all of that as a good thing. Or, a little bit more moderately, we slow down, pause, see what we lost, and maybe return to the good natural life. After all, I don't know exactly, I can't remember on the spot who said it, but if you chase nature out the door with a pitchfork, it'll just come right back in through the window. So what are we doing? Are we chasing nature out the door and inviting it back in with a pitchfork? Or can we actually think these things through for a moderate alternative? I got carried away there, but what kind
Yes, I love it. We want to see Miller Mania here. I love it. Get excited. So a lot of this, I can see you're saying is starting with some sort of failed presupposition all the way back at the beginning, twists and turns and distortions leading you to an outcome and to a philosophy that's not useful, I guess. And so we want to begin with Heidegger. It's a new beginning, yeah?
So we want to, so the beginning with Heidegger. Heidegger, as I said earlier, tried to say, is super important for all of these schools of thought. I've been giving you Strauss. Strauss said that Heidegger, his review of the history of philosophy, made possible a return to the classical alternative. It made possible a recovery of Plato and Aristotle. Now, Heidegger wasn't particularly interested in their political philosophy. He wanted to know about their interpretation of being, their understanding of being. And when Heidegger returned to Plato, he wanted to overcome Plato. He said Plato is the cause of so many problems for us. Plato's interpretation of being gave rise to culture, ideology, religion, and it really blocked us from our access to the original event of being. And therefore, Heidegger's philosophy of another beginning is an overcoming of Plato. But in showing that the history of philosophy had been this series of distortions on the basis of a poor understanding of what happened at first, he made possible for Strauss the return to the political philosophy of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And Strauss doesn't want to overcome Plato and Aristotle. He wants to recover them, recover their teaching, which he thinks is the sound and true teaching about the nature of political life and human life. So even between these two thinkers, Strauss and Heidegger, they have to return to the beginning. They return to Plato, and again, Heidegger makes that possible for Strauss, but they diverge here very much. One is a recovery of Platonic political philosophy, and another one is an overcoming of Plato in order to reinaugurate a new history of the meaning of being.
It's kind of a bummer to think that basically our entire political philosophical thought started with an error like thousands of years ago, and we've just been like careening off in an erroneous path.
Yeah, so I want to say here two things. According to Heidegger, there are a couple of difficult but important distinctions, and I want to just try to bring them up here simply. So according to Heidegger, this history of distortions and errors is not a function of the specific thinker who just got it wrong and could have gotten it right, and we can just go back and correct them or something like that. In fact, the history of philosophy for Heidegger is a history of being's own unfolding. It belongs to the eschatological drama of being itself, for us to have forgotten it and for it to have, as it were, withdrawn from us. That is somehow a destiny that is built into being itself. Now, not all the people who read Heidegger shared his view that we live in this being's own destinal history. Strauss, for example, also thought that there were errors that were made, let's say, or shifts from the classical teaching that were on the whole bad rather than good. But he, much differently than Heidegger, said, these are the deliberate acts of political philosophers who are, as it were, the founders of a new mode of self-understanding. So it's not that they interpreted the world the way they did because that's the stage of being's own self-revelation that they happen to be in. They made the deliberate, calculated act of breaking with the classical teaching for reasons that we can recover and dispute. Now, Strauss gives a lot more, you might say, acknowledgement to the agency of the political philosophers. They're the true hidden legislators of our human history. They're the ones who decide somehow the shape of the era that we're going to be in, because they teach the legislators, they teach the statesmen. They, after all, let's say you're Americans, Canadians, those of us, I'm in Canada, as some of you may know, so I can't just talk as though I'm in the US, but we all live under the canopy of our regimes. Our regimes somehow form our characters and our souls, our ways of speaking, what we like, what we dislike, what we praise, what we blame, what we regard as noble, what we regard as base. But the regime itself is also dependent on these trans-political or somehow more fundamental arguments among the philosophers like Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke. They provided the conceptual armaments or the conceptual tools or wherewithal for the constitutional construction, constitutional self-understanding, and acts of statesmanship at a more explicitly political level. Okay? So Strauss said these are the figures where if we really want to know where we are, where we've come, and what we left out, sort of the sacrifices that we had to make at the level of key ideas, we have to turn our attention to the most outstanding figures in the history of political philosophy and recover the reasoning that led them to make the breaks with the tradition that they made. He traced the fundamental break to Machiavelli, and it's an amazing account what Machiavelli did, why he did it, and how that changed our world understanding, all the way up to the foundation of the America's commercial republic. But Heidegger says no. This is not deliberate acts of philosophical agents. Somehow, when you think philosophically, you expose yourself to the beating heart of being, and it sort of like it pulses through you. You know, there's this passage that I like. I'm no expert in these topics, but it's a Christian idea. Let's say, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. So somehow when people think about being or they think about the first principles, they're thinking about it, but the closer you get to it, it's now thinking through them. They're crucified with the Christ of being. They're alive, but it's working through them. There's much less of that in Strauss, much less of this interplay between Christ and the cross, so to speak, interpreted philosophically, or between being and the human being. So as you see, like these are complicated and deep issues, but the amazing thing is that they are alive for everybody, whether we know it or not. They affect everything, whether we know it or not. We can either make clear to ourselves the sense in which they affect us politically and personally, or we can just be the unconscious objects of their activity behind the scenes.
Well, I'd rather know, and I think that the guys listening to this podcast would rather know as well. Do you want to get into the basics of Heidegger that you laid out before we branch off into the reaction and interpretation by the four thinkers? You know, should we start with Dasein or historicism, or where do you want to start?
I want to start like this. I think that if we just go into Heidegger's terminology, it can be hard to get hold of right off the bat. Because Dasein and historicity and dropping French terms, like, okay, I'm not going to do it here. So the key thing is, how does this concern us actually? Well, Heidegger, at the beginning of Being and Time, at the beginning of this book, Being and Time, he's got many books, but he said he's a man of one book. He's always raising the same question in different ways, from different perspectives, okay? He's a man of one book. His question has to do somehow with the meaning of being or the truth of being. Well, that still can sound abstract. How do we relate that to ourselves in a way that makes sense? I find that this is helpful, but let me just give you a quick prelude. So he refers at the beginning of Being Time to a dialogue of Plato's called the Sophist. And in the Sophist, you have two people discussing various explanations for what is the world, like atoms and the void. Is it water, earth, and air? Okay, however you might think, what is the stuff of reality? And so some of them, let's say that the world can be explained with as water and air, for example. So the characters in the Sophist, they say, all right, you tell me that water is and air is, and that these two are the explanatory principles of the whole. But tell me, please, when you say that they are, is being a third thing besides them? Because you're saying that they are, that they exist. What do you mean by their being or their existing? Is that some third thing or what? And what the character in the Sophist says is, when I was younger, I used to be perplexed by the question of non-being, of non-existence. But as I mature and begin to think about these things, I'm really perplexed by the meaning of being. What does it mean to be? I mean, these natural scientists who are explaining the world in terms of some number of principles are leaving something explained, what they mean when they say that those things are. So Heidegger starts being a time with that reference to the Sophist, and he says that this questioning over and conflict over the meaning of being is a battle of the giants. It's a big question, it's a big dispute. Okay, so that sets the stage in some sense, but how do we drive it home to ourselves? In one of his books, he does this in a way that I personally found very helpful. We always talk about being. My cup is empty. The phone is on the table. I say is, and I understand it, and so do you, and so do we all. And yet, if we turn our concentration to our rough pre-understanding of being, which is all through our speech, we get this kind of puzzle that on some level, we don't have any idea what we mean by saying that something. When you say it is on the table, what do you mean that it is? Well, it's there, okay? You start asking this question. You start trying to clarify this rough preconceptual understanding of being, and what happens is it opens up a huge continent of questions, of insights, of intuitions, and of somehow self-transformation in Heidegger. He says, after all, you are a human being. Being is not something that's accidental to you. The relationship of the human and being is more than trivial. It's of central importance. And so you start with this puzzle. We roughly understand what being means, but we actually don't really understand what it means. And you add this additional reflection. He says, and we usually don't care. Like, we're usually not bothered by that disjunction. Fine, you roughly understand it, who cares? It's the most comprehensible thing. It's an empty concept. It's what you can say about anything that it is. Like, what's the big deal? Give me a break. And so Heidegger says, if you combine these three things and you actually allow yourself to be open to the weirdness of that situation, you know it, but you don't know it, and you don't care. All of that is a message to ourselves about something fundamental about us, he says. And the whole task is to take that little thread and pull on it, to take that little insight and develop it, let it unfold, let it unravel. When we begin to understand ourselves in light not of our biology, not of our psychology, not of our preferences towards this and that, but when we really pose the question, what does it mean about us that we have an understanding of being? What does that tell us about ourselves? Well, he says it tells you everything about yourself when you really pull on that thread. So Being in Time says, let's take a second look at all of the things that we take for granted about our everyday attitude towards ourselves in the world. And when you do this with an eye to the question of our understanding of being, you begin, he says, to distinguish some structures of human existence that are usually obscure to us, usually not accessible to us. And he really develops that through Being in Time. What he comes to at the end of it is, here's another analogy that may be helpful in different ways for different people. So imagine a building, okay, 10 floors on the building or something like that, and we're used to being on the 10th floor and treating it as the ground floor. We have something that we regard as a basis or a foundation, okay, whether it's the sciences, the constitution of the sciences, okay, physical reality, math, everything that you take for granted, including everything that you take for granted about yourself, that you're a subject, that there's a world of objects, that you know what reality is roughly. And what Heidegger says is, in fact, that 10th floor is not the ground floor, even though you think it is. And you can drill down and drive down and get to the bottom of these conceptual constructions that shape every day, consciously or unconsciously, and sometimes even explicitly in the positive sciences, our understanding of ourselves in the world. He calls that fundamental ontology. It means understanding the meaning of being, or raising the question of the meaning of being, at a fundamental level, from the ground floor. And not on the basis of any of these previous distorted interpretations, as Ed said earlier, and not on the basis of our inherited traditional self-understanding, and also not on the basis of our naive everyday understanding. So what he says is that in our everyday mode, we are entangled in the world of things that we take care of. So you tend your affairs, and somehow in tending your affairs in all of the ways that we do that, we do not distinguish adequately between ourselves and our affairs. We may distinguish between them, but it would be on the basis of a distorted interpretation where I say, look, there's the world out there and I'm an individual rational subject or something like that. But he says, let's pull this all apart. Let's get to the bottom of who we actually are. And he comes to this famous word, Dasein, and this famous phrase, being in the world, hyphenated in der Weltsein, being in the world, which says that our basic reality, our basic constitution, is not that we are separate from the world, but that worldliness and world is a constitutive structure of our existence. You have never been worldless. You have never been just an isolated atom that's separate from a world that came into it like I pour water into a cup. Somehow, the ordinary self-understanding is derivative from this more fundamental existential constitution or configuration of the human being. And people were floored in his analysis or assessment of this because he drove the question down to its basics, unfolded it from there, and gave people a lot of insight and self-understanding about themselves that they didn't have before. But that isn't trivial in the sense, not to trivialize it, it's not like I had some insight, I went to a Zen class and I had some insight that everything is nothing or something like that. It's a well-founded, rigorous presentation at the basis of the deepest origins of ourselves and world understanding. So Dasein is the word that he gives. If I say, who are you? Okay, I'm Michael Millerman. Okay, but what is Michael Millerman? I'm a human being. Okay, fine. What do you mean by human being? Well, I'm a body, a soul, and a spirit. Maybe. Now we're getting into the answer. Now we're getting into the dimension of some potential answers, right? Or I say, well, I'm a rational animal. I'm like animals, but with reason. Or I say, I'm will to power. That's a different type. Or I say, my DNA. I'm just my DNA. Whatever the case is. What Heidegger says is all of these kinds of answers that you give about what you are or who you are, what the world is, they all presuppose some notions, ideas, and interpretations that they haven't clarified for themselves. And so on this 10th floor, one room, 1001, explains you like on the level of psychology, another on the level of biology, another on the level of whatever. But they have in common this unquestioned presupposition. And that's why when he pulls the carpet out from them, he pulls it out from all of them. Ideologically, he does the same thing with Nazism, liberalism, and communism, because he says they also all share a faulty philosophical foundation. And when he is anti-liberal, kind of like Dugin in this sense, he's not going from room 1001 to room 1002. He's saying, let's go down to the ground floor and then see what things look like from there. Maybe the whole picture looks different when you've driven it down to its basis.
How does one understand oneself in a pure way without using something that's outside of themselves to describe them?
That's a good question. What Heidegger says is that we are so constituted as to be able to disclose through our speaking. Our speech has the function, or can have the function, of being disclosive. And we are so built that we can be self-disclosive in our self-interpretation. Okay, so here there's actually like a relationship between speaking, the function of speaking as potentially disclosive, and the fact that we ourselves are a self-interpreting being. When you put all of that together, he says we can disclose our true being without having to interpret ourselves in terms of the things that we usually are taking care of or are engaged in projects with. We ourselves have the interpretive linguistic wherewithal to be self-disclosive, according to Heidegger. So it can be helpful to draw on images, which is a long tradition in the history of philosophy, the cave allegory being an example of that, and Heidegger sometimes, rarely, but still sometimes has recourse to his own images. But ultimately it's hermeneutics, self-interpretation. It is not, we don't just happen to be interpreting beings, it's crucial for who we are, that our speaking is disclosive and that we can be self-disclosing in acts of interpretation. So people who haven't read Heidegger, I think interpretation might be for them like, I read a book and I try to interpret what it's saying to me, what it means. Like I'm doing an interpretation of a text or something like that. Interpretation in Heidegger has somehow a more technical sense. It has a couple of components to it, but one of them is the one that I just said. Our speech isn't just descriptive. It's not just that I see an object. Here's my phone. I describe it. It has such and such dimensions. It has such and such a weight. There's a lot of stuff that I can say about it. And my speech about it is true if it matches up, right? If I say this is red, my speech is false. If I say that it's black, then my speech is true, roughly speaking, right? Heidegger said that is one of the, I mean, that's an important function of language, but it's somehow not the way that we drive to a genuine self-understanding. What we need to see is that language it clears reality for us and allows beings to show themselves as what they are. It's not just description that we slap onto things and then check against the reality. It is disclosive. So this, eventually anybody who studies Heidegger gets into him and examines themselves in light of what he offers us, has to reorient somehow their understanding of language, speech, and even somehow of orientation, perception, and just directedness in terms of being world disclosing. So that's what he says ultimately. That's how he can pull the scales from our eyes without having to have recourse from something outside of ourselves.
Is this being, this inner self, unobscured by the outside and our entanglements? Is this a universal thing, or is it different for each person? How does that work?
So there are some questions here that he, I wouldn't say, resolved adequately, because he has talked about Greek Dasein, he's talked about human Dasein, he's talked about German Dasein, and it becomes an open question in some sense whether at the deepest level, this fundamental reality, like you could put it this way, is the ground floor, are there rooms on the ground floor too, right? Is there a plurality of Daseins? Is the existential basis of human life one or many? Dugin took up this question. He actually developed the thesis of the existential plurality of Daseins through a careful analysis of the way that the Russian language includes the word being, which is very different from the way that the German language includes the word being. So Dugin said there are a lot of Russian words that if you were to translate Heidegger into Russian, Heidegger had to make up some weird German like neologism to say what he wanted to say, whereas there's an absolutely ordinary, customary Russian word that has being in the root that says the same thing. And so he said, let's do a careful examination of the Russian language and see whether it indicates to us the distinctness of Russian Dasein in the service of the more general thesis of the existential plurality of Dasein. So when he went and talked to a famous Heidegger scholar, the scholar assured him that Heidegger thought there was a universality somehow at the fundamental level. But Dugin says, no, if we develop the methodology, we'll see a key difference here. And by the way, in my view, that makes Dugin very interesting as somebody who's a reader of Heidegger, because after all, it matters whether we say that at our deepest level. Again, you might say it's clear that cultures are different, civilizations are different, people are different. These people like fish, these people don't. Okay, you dance this way, you dance that way, you're very colorful, you're very dry and boring. These are somehow superficial differences, cultural, this type of music, that type of music, and everything. But if the difference concerns a different relationship toward being itself, as indicated through language, among other things, and then you trace the difference at that level, now you're into something that's pretty serious, I would say, not trivial. And Dugin is doing that on the basis of Heidegger's work.
Language being a human thing that we developed, is it a useful tool to examine such of the deepest, most fundamental issues, facing us on being? Is language itself not sort of, what was the word that you used in the book? Obscured or something? Just entangled with this outside. I mean, is it a pure expression, this disclosiveness?
It can be. It isn't as a rule, but it can be. So Heidegger says that for the most part, we speak out of ambiguity, confusion, and curiosity. So in other words, we speak about things without really knowing what they are, as though we know what they are. We speak about everything as a rule with some kind of equivalent indifference toward its rank importance. And the result is that public speech tends to be very ambiguous.
Sounds like I might have lost Michael there for a second. All right, everybody, stand by. I don't know what's happening here. Anybody got Michael Millerman on their screen? I have lost Michael. Oh, and Michael is gone. So we're going to just kill a couple of minutes here when Michael makes his way back. A little bit hard for me to... Oh, here we go. And we're back.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, nice. All right, keep going.
Yeah. So
where were we? Who knows?
According to Heidegger, our language, our speaking in the public sphere, Heidegger says publicness as such is characterized by its ambiguity, by its curiosity, by its idle chatter. And frankly, when you read those passages, I mean, I read them at the start of the coronavirus pandemic when it wasn't clear what was going on. And it's as though he's writing, again, exactly about what's going on. Because people are saying one thing and it seems like something else. You don't know where the truth lies. He says that's just built into the structure of public speech, because it is not using its language to disclose the truth about anything. It's just speaking out of curiosity about everything without distinction. But sort of like in Plato's cave allegory, we can turn our soul around from the shadows to the process of exiting the cave through education. In Heidegger, it's in principle possible for us to turn ourselves around, so to speak, and make our language deliberate and have it be genuinely being disclosive, have it genuinely reveal the truth about ourselves and about the world. So it can be that, but as a rule it isn't. And he tries to snap us back and show us how to have, once again, a proper appreciation for what language is. It is not just a tool for him. It's what sort of puts us in touch with the ground of our existence. So I'm not saying, look, all of this is super, how would you put it? It's like difficult on one hand. It's something that if Heidegger is right, we're not used to doing, because we usually are in the mode of doing the opposite. That's built into his analysis. As a rule, everybody is not turned in toward the structures of their existence. They're turned outward toward the things that they're doing, the things that they're taking care of, the things that they have dealings with. But the problem is that we then derive our self-interpretation in terms of the world that we take care of, rather than in terms of our proper constitution. When we take note of our proper constitution, life gets more interesting, I would say.
And where have you settled on this subject of universal Dasein? Like, is it, if you drill all the way down to the ground floor on each individual all around the world, do you get to the same place, or is it a different place? This is such a crucial thing, right?
This is a crucial thing. I would say, first of all, I don't know. Okay. Second of all, though, when Dugin does this experiment, he elaborates this thesis on the basis of the existential analysis of the Russian language. There's a lot there that is very persuasive and thought-provoking. Why should it be the case that these words having to do with being are so different and so obviously not parallel to the German ones? So I think it's a path well worth developing further, understanding further. That's why I wrote about Dugin's Heidegger in the book, and why I continue to think about what he's brought to light. However, I should say that there's another way we can approach these questions, Strauss's way, which I also find has a lot going for it. And Strauss, because he somehow doesn't go all the way into pure philosophy, but he combines wisdom and moderation, or philosophy with a concern for the issues of political life, he, to my view, makes a persuasive case that separately of how we think about being and all that, there's a universal commonality among human beings when it comes to the questions of political life. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to live the right way of life. There's just a dispute over what the right way of life is. But so Strauss says that questions that people raise across time and across place are questions that belong to man as such, not to, German, French, Anglo-Eastern, or whatever. They are the fundamental questions of concern for the human being as such. So Strauss has a sort of universality there when it comes to the level of the fundamental questions, but he combines it by saying that there's never going to be an answer to that question that everybody can accept. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is that he says most people are not philosophical. Most people do not get the truth. They get the opinion version of the truth, or the opinion version of something. And that every opinion, by its nature, gives rise to a counter opinion. So in order for the universality of truth to imply political universality, it would have to be in principle possible for everybody in political life to comprehend the universal truth. But if politics is at a lower level than philosophy, if it's the realm of opinion rather than truth, and if opinion gives rise to a counter opinion, then even the universality of the fundamental issues, the universality of the essence of man, is still going to imply a closed society or a multipolar world. Many political communities, many political organizations, each of them built on their partial grasp or on their partial version, or in short, on their opinion. There are going to be many caves, even if there's one sun. So you see, that's, to my mind, that is, without having to drive us into questions of the meaning of human existence, also a pretty plausible and helpful way, I think, of looking at the relationship between the universal and the particular.
Many caves, one sun. That's a good way of putting it right there. That resonated with me. Without going off on a tangent too far, you said something I wanted to ask you about. You said everybody wants to be happy. Is that really true? Does everybody want to be happy? Some people want to be of service. Some people want to give sacrifice. Some people think that their purpose is work. You know, I don't know. Is it universally accepted in philosophy that everybody wants to be happy?
I think the idea here is that people think that they will find satisfaction in work. People think that they will find satisfaction in service. So there's some relationship here between what people think will satisfy them, right? I think that being of service to others will fulfill me or make me feel, satisfy my self-conception. I called that happiness. Now, we can make, in fact, the distinction between satisfaction, well, let me put it this way. I think it's fair to say, at least among the people that I've read, they acknowledge that, yeah, everybody's trying to satisfy their self-understanding. Everybody wants satisfaction. And there's a dispute over whether happiness is what we should call that. Now, I actually want to say something more about that. Kovev, Alexander Kovev, who wrote this introduction to the reading of Hegel and who disputed with Strauss in the book on tyranny, Hegel said that everybody desires recognition. Everybody wants to be recognized as an individual of infinite worth and dignity. And that all human history, all work, all struggle, all wars, and all revolutions are in the service of and for the sake of satisfying that desire for recognition. Until you reach the point where, in principle, there is universal mutual recognition of one another's individual dignity. But he said that becomes a question and a problem. How did we get from the beginning of human history to the stage when everybody is satisfied, finally, if, in principle, of having their individual dignity recognized? Now, Koev's model helps us, I think, understand a lot of identity politics type thinking in the contemporary world, because a lot of the marginalized figures and communities, they don't want to be marginalized. They want to be on the margins. They want their universal infinite human dignity and worth to be recognized. That's totally in line with what Kovev said is the decisive human desire. However, he thought that this decisive human desire could only truly be satisfied in a universal world state. So it requires, if you think that every human being more than everything seeks the recognition of their individual dignity, then he said it follows that you have to have a single universal political community. Strauss, when he disputed with Kovev, he said, first of all, that's a very big problem. A universal world state is a big problem, okay? Because it's going to exercise all kinds of control over people that is worse than any type of tyranny you've ever imagined in the past or could be, especially if it's a universal world state ruled by someone who's unwise, an unwise tyrant with no opposition, no checks and balances. Let's not go there. That's the political answer. But the philosophical answer was, he says it's not true that all human beings seek universal recognition. There are some human beings like Socrates who are satisfied by just having a few good friends that they can philosophize with together. They don't need the whole world to want them. They don't need the whole world to love them. He said that's primarily a feature of the political human being. The political man, the political ruler, is the one who wants everybody to love him. He's the one who, if he could universalize his rule, could have everybody say that he's the man or something like that. But that's distinct from the philosopher's motivations. So whether we're satisfied by recognition, universal recognition, or whether we're satisfied by a different sort of happiness, for example, by just philosophizing with a few good friends, like Socrates does, is a big deal. A lot rests on that distinction. When I said that everybody wants to be happy, I meant everybody has something that they think will satisfy them. They have some opinion about what the good life is. And these are two fundamental alternatives. By the way, hugely relevant to us, because Kovev thought that American life was the end of history. He said when he visited America, he no longer had to speculate about what human life would look like at the end of history. It was America, where in principle, mutual recognition has been, not if guaranteed in practice, it's been acknowledged as that which we're striving to embody. There's no idea after that. It's all about individual worth, individual dignity. And when you play that out, as I say, you get globalist consequences, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I guess he didn't come to America yesterday and start taking a look around at what's happening here, because the end of the history seems to have ended, no?
Well, look, you have two things again here. You have the idea that everybody's individual dignity should be recognized, and then you have all the hustle and bustle associated with the instantiation of that idea or that principle. So here's the question really is, have we gotten beyond in the Western world the idea that the most important thing is the universal acknowledgement of human dignity, separately from all the hustle and bustle of this change of government, that change of government, this change of leadership, that one, these quasi-revolutionaries, these quasi-revolutionaries. And so I think that the tendency to call everybody a racist, a fascist, reactionary, and all of that, a tendency that you're familiar with and I assume most of your listeners are familiar with, it actually is a reflection of this idea that anything that denies the absolute essential, how would you put it, leveling or something like that, anything that introduces distinction or difference. Now, obviously, it's a self-refuting position, because when you say, if I say, us and them thinking is fascistic, and I am an anti-fascist, and therefore anybody who has us and them thinking is not us, it's them, and therefore I'm going to destroy them. That's obviously a self-refuting, self-perpetuating fascist anti-fascism. And you don't even have to think very deeply. You don't need Strauss or Heidegger or Kovev or any of these guys to see the absurdity of that. Okay, but still. So somehow the implicit, if you were to be charitable to those people, the implicit thing that they're trying to say is we want to get rid of all kinds of supremacy. We want to get rid of all kind of authority. Yes, we might have to institute a counter-authority or a counter-supremacy in the meanwhile, but the ultimate goal will be to overcome these distinctions. So I think there's something that's still helpful about the contemporary situation, something helpful in reading Kovev and Hegel and these end of history theorists in understanding the contemporary situation if we separate, again, the hustle and bustle from the principles, the obviously self-refuting, idiotic, kindergarten level political analysis from the implied principles beneath the surface, which we have to do. Because by the way, what's really frightening, what's really embarrassing, I would say, and you talk to people from other parts of the world and you really get a clear sense of this, contemporary American political rhetoric in the halls of Congress, where a men, a women, and all of this kind of thing, it's just, to call it a kindergarten level thinking is really to insult kindergartners. This is just, honestly, doesn't even merit comment as to how lowbrow it is, but unfortunately, that's the state of contemporary political rhetoric to a certain extent. And I think the task of anybody who smells it for what it is to elevate the discourse on the basis of more thoughtful restatements of the key issues, and to chase the stupidity away.
Plenty of stupidity to go around these days, that is for sure. Can I get an A woman on that? All right. So, all right, have we given a good enough intro, you think, to Heidegger? Is there one more thing you want to talk about before we get into the Strauss, Rorty, and Derrida and Dugin sort of interpretations and their synthesis?
I think we've hit, the main points as best as we can in a way. There's a lot of different aspects to his thought, a lot of different ways of presenting it. As I mentioned, the question of the meaning of being or the truth of being, its distortions over the history of philosophy, the recovery of the basic insight at the beginning, inauguration of a new history or a new dispensation of philosophy. That's his bread and butter. It goes through the reading of a lot of these philosophers because he says, let's try to derive the insight of what Kant or Hegel or Descartes or Aristotle was actually trying to say. Let's get as much as we can about what comes through in their thinking about their relationship to being itself. So he has a lot of studies of these classical thinkers, by the way, which are amazing, and I recommend them to anybody. It's difficult reading, but eventually you get the hang of it and it becomes super satisfying. And I think that's good. I mean, setting a million other details aside, I think it's good for our purposes.
Indeed. And if you could just sum it up in 2 sentences, which we can't, but just try. Why is Heidegger considered one of the greatest philosophers of our time? You even said perhaps of thousands of years.
Yeah, because he read with such diligence, concentration, and skill books and texts that we thought we had understood, that we treated as already somehow self-evident. Everybody knows what Aristotle said because he's been refuted by Descartes. Everybody knows what Descartes says because he's been refuted by the next guy. And somehow the history of philosophy was just seen as a more or less easily comprehensible set of thinkers who you can slot into their proper position and all of the key living issues. Strauss says that Heidegger absolutely floored his generation because in the way that he lectured on Aristotle and Plato, he showed that nobody had understood a thing of what they said they understood, and therefore that the supposed refutations hadn't actually occurred. Somehow modern philosophy is premised on a refutation of classical philosophy. But if that refutation didn't understand the classical teaching, then obviously it's a worthless refutation. That means that everything is open once more to reinvestigation. So the way that he read the great authors of the history of philosophy was somehow the mark of his excellence as a teacher early on, but also just his again, aptitude and diligence in highlighting these deep structures of the human being itself in relationship to the reading of these texts. People were just floored. And again, his contemporaries they took for granted, oh, yes, we've reached a scientific stage of human development and we have a rational interpretation of myth and history and man, and somehow we can put everything together on the basis of reasons, construction of concepts and categories. Okay, the alternative school to Heidegger, Neo-Kantians. And Heidegger came along and made these people seem like absolute, he showed the poverty of their thought.
Such a nice way, an eloquent way of saying that. All right, well, I'm starting to have a better understanding of Strauss and the notion of not all that is new is good and not all that is old is bad, which is like a new way of looking at things, which strikes me as being insane. Maybe I've just come up in this, hanging out with a bunch of Claremont guys and Straussians and whatever, and, constantly talking about Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and looking back on the ancient texts and whatnot. Camille Paglia, also a big influence on me in that regard as well, too. So I'm beginning to understand.
Yeah, Strauss had a lot to do with contemporaries who consider the classical teaching as a living alternative. It wasn't the case in the same way before he did his recovery of the possibility of a return to the ancients. They were seen as a thing of the past.
That's crazy to me. Yeah. It's crazy to me. It seems insane that at some point in our modern history, like people would just discounted ancient texts and ancient philosophy, even though all those human beings, they lived with other human beings and they organized human beings and had all the same issues and same social issues and same economic issues and same warring, all that somehow just because they were old and had been chewed up and through distortions, as you've pointed out here, that they were irrelevant or not worthwhile.
It shows you how deeply rooted the prejudice, the progressivist prejudice had become, that there's more truth further in time. And that why would you want to go back? What would you learn from Plato besides seeing the prejudices of an ancient Greek pederast or something like that, right? You can't learn anything from Plato except about how to hate women and how to love young men. According, I'm simplifying, but only roughly. Like there are still progressivists today, I think, who are saying, don't read Homer, don't read this, don't read that, because all you have there are the relics of an unenlightened age. At most, it's a history of error. But why would you ever want to not just learn about them, but learn from them about the truth of human life? Well, Strauss made this colossal effort of reviving the possibility of learning from the classics, but he didn't just assert it or stipulate it. He had to show where we had gone wrong, how it is that we broke from the classical teaching in the first place, what progressivism about human life gets wrong, and what a return to the classics would look like. But yeah, it's incredible that today we take for granted something that then was, or that we can take for granted as a result of places who are, working in a Straussian spirit, whereas before he had to fight, go upstream to justify this possibility.
Yeah. Fascinating. So much going on there. And I can see how even our current modern political, quagmire has been influenced by all these conversations and all this political thought. And let's get into that a little bit more. You picked four philosophers to study their relationship with Heidegger and how it impacted them and sort of the interplay of their work and their ideas. Why did you pick these four people? And then let's get into each one of them, to understand where you're coming from here.
Yeah, so many political philosophers and theorists have been influenced by Heidegger. I picked four. First of all, and my original list was longer, but you have to make this somehow manageable. And what I wanted to do was to pull from different geopolitical sort of constellations. So I had the French Heideggerianism in there with Derrida, somehow the American social democratic freewheeling pragmatism of Richard Rorty, Dugin again, who in most accounts, if you were just to ask people, he's far right or something like that. If they had to give a name without thinking further about it, they'd put him to the right of all of these other thinkers. And Strauss, who was seen politically as a neoconservative, therefore as somehow center-right, and who represented a different kind of American reception of Heidegger, one that traces its roots to because Strauss left Germany in 1932, so it was like a quasi-German, quasi-American reception. But the goal, in two words, was to see how the whole political spectrum from right to left read Heidegger, and to try to, as I say, take account of what each reading got right and got wrong, and to see why they ended up on the left or on the right or in the center. Was that a function of their philosophical reasoning, a function of their political inclinations, or a function of something else altogether? And by doing that sort of triangulation across the geopolitical and ideological spectrum, to try to restore or recover a more complete Heidegger and a more complete understanding of how the philosophical relates to the political more generally.
And in looking at these four, without digging into all the details on each, what themes arose? What did you discover? What?
The key theme, I would say, for the French thinkers, or for Derrida. Now, some of what I'm going to say is more general than what's in the book, naturally, but I think that this, as I mentioned earlier, the deconstructive tendency, I summarized it for myself as they take Heidegger's first part and they leave out his second part. To me, that was a big insight, because if you didn't do a comparative reading, in my case, if I hadn't done a comparative reading of these receptions, and if I hadn't been introduced to the importance of another beginning in Heidegger's thought through Dugin, I might have been left thinking that the French Heideggerians give you all that there is to know about him and just take him, go further or something. But actually, they leave out, somehow, they've excised the heart of his project. They've taken something and just cut it off completely. And their reasons for doing so are highly questionable, or rather, are political rather than philosophical. That's what I thought at the outset. I still think there's something to that. So that helped me to understand the French reception of Heidegger. I should say about Derrida that at the outset of the study, I thought Derrida is a leftist political hack who reinterprets Heidegger in terms of leftist ideology. That's what I was expecting to find. That's what I thought. That was my opening gambit. But my initial supervisor resigned over my work on Dugin and sort of blacklisted me and tried to cut my funding out from under my feet and stuff like that. But my replacement supervisor was this leftist named Ruth Marshall, who works on like African Pentecostalism and all kinds of interesting political theology type questions. And she said to me, as she got to know me and got to know my work and my interest, that there's going to be a lot in Derrida that I should work through him patiently, and I will find that it's not the case that he's a political hack who bent Heidegger to leftist aims. And in fact, she was right. The more I read Derrida, the more respect I gained for him. And the more I understood that he's extremely sensitive reader of these issues and of these questions. But one thing in particular, so before I was ever in academia, before I started studying philosophy as an undergraduate, first in Winnipeg, then in Vancouver, if any Americans know where these cities are or what they
Winnipeg.
are, I'm sure you do. Yeah, Winnipeg, that's where I started my undergraduate studies. So before I even was thinking about going into university, I was very much into mysticism, into comparative sort of, like I have an older brother and an older sister. We had books lying around the house by existentialists and psychoanalysts and beatniks, but also religious books and sort of mystical books. And I tended toward them, I read them, and I resonated with them. I thought they were super fascinating. And at some point, I seemed to discover that there's one experience that they're all having, the mystical experience, something like that, but that they're interpreting in terms of the tradition that's available to them. So someone was interpreting this most important human experience available to us. That's how they were characterizing it, like union with God, union with the Almighty. Someone was characterizing that as being crucified on the cross with Jesus. Someone was characterizing it in terms of something from their mystical tradition, Jewish, Islamic, existentialist, psychoanalytic. So that was really amazing to me, and that's what I wanted to study initially as an academic. I was going to go into religious studies, I was going to write a book on mysticism, and I was going to go all in. All my first year essays are all about, was Plato a mystic, about psychology and mysticism. Everything was about the mystical experience. To me, that was like the peak of human existence. And one of the things I learned in working on Derrida and Heidegger is that Derrida related the mystical tradition to some of Heidegger's insights about our exposure to being and all of that kind of thing. So Derrida's sensitivity to the question of mysticism was really endeared him to me. So he's really thoughtful on religion, on mysticism, and on these kinds of experiences. And when my supervisor fed me these readings, I gradually came around to seeing Derrida in a positive light. And that's why, in some sense, to me, the most surprising chapter of the book is the Derrida chapter. He's like, in a sense, the hidden hero for me of the book, because he's the one who I was most strongly predisposed against. And in fact, I found that he's a really good reader, really sensitive reader of Heidegger, even if ultimately I disagree with where he takes things. But more generally, the French Heideggerians are deconstruction minus inception, minus another beginning of philosophy. So that's sort of how I characterize them roughly. Rorty, Richard Rorty, an American pragmatist social democrat, he was also influenced by Heidegger, except he says, look, Heidegger has this history of being's own self-forgetting and alienation and destiny and all of that. He said, let's just forget about all of that. That's kind of too poetic, too mythical, too nostalgic to recover some lost past, and pessimistic and everything. Let's just get rid of all of that. But what Heidegger shows us is he gives us the tools to see language as something that we can use to freely redescribe ourselves and our experience of the world. So somehow Heidegger liberates a creative, playful attitude towards language, according to Rorty. And if we forget about the motivation of wanting to know the truth or wanting to get to the essence of being, he's like, set all of that aside, just get rid of it, ignore it, and instead use what Heidegger taught you to have this new relationship toward the world that will give you sort of free expression of human and social individuality. Rorty has this idea, take care of freedom and the truth will take care of itself. Truth is what arises in the free, creative language games and speaking agreements and arrangements of human beings. Stop trying to orient your politics on the basis of nature, essence, or truth. Come to see all of that as metaphorical, none of it as real, and reality itself as a metaphor. And he learned that from Heidegger and sort of like gave him the ability of free redescription independently of the question of the truth of anything. I don't like that. I think that Rorty is on one side, he's Strauss, Heidegger, Derrida, Dugin, and myself all sort of worship philosophy. For us, philosophy is like the highest life, it's the philosophical supremacists is what I call them. Okay, none of them would ever dismiss it or denounce it or downplay it or treat it as exactly as equivalent to like a children's storybook or any other literature, leveling it down to one among a number of linguistic metaphorical operations. I don't like that. I can't stand that. And I think he's wrong. But he's still helpful in showing what's presupposed by some social democratic thinking. That on one hand, we're not going to be bound by any type of concept. Everything's going to be free. And we're not even concerned about the truth of what's free, so long as it's just kind of like this chaotic, playful expression of human creative individuality. Not that the human is a free creative individuality, because you can't say that anything is anything, because that's a metaphysical assertion. If I say the human being is a free creative individual, I've gone too far for Rorty. No, he isn't. But if you want to talk about it that way, go ahead. If it gives you access to something, if it helps you build a better boat or whatever, lets you have more fun, then go ahead. Just don't ever hypnotize yourself into believing that when you say that something is something, you're getting at the metaphysical truth of it. No, you're not. You never will. Don't go there. That's Rorty. And I try to identify what I think is wrong, what I think is self-refuting in his arguments, and why I think that he's not particularly helpful as a reader of Heidegger, even though, like I said, he has carved out his idea about this relationship between politics and philosophy, that not philosophical supremacy like Derrida and the other guys hold, has carved out a certain constitution of the political or relationship between philosophy and politics that privileges the political, puts the philosophical as one among a number of alternatives, but it's one existing and important and viable, maybe, configuration of the relationship between politics and philosophy. That was my key question throughout this project. How do these thinkers, and we use Heidegger as a access point, think about the relationship between philosophy and politics? So Rorty clearly does not see philosophy über alles, okay, so not as a philosophical supremacist. No, somehow the free politics gives you is the basis, okay, but these other guys see it differently. So that was Rorty. He's still important. I'm not saying don't read him, don't learn from him. I'm not saying he's wrong about everything. Just I didn't think he got Heidegger right, and I disagree with his assessment, of philosophy's character and importance.
I think we talked about this, but maybe you could just hammer this home for me again. The connection between philosophy and politics. Is there some assumption that politics is meant to do something different than philosophy, or how should I say this? Is politics meant to be the mechanism by which we reach this happiness or the recognition or the good? Why are they even connected? How do you rule people connected to the philosophy and the understanding of the good and the good life?
So let's say that it doesn't have to be, but it can be, and we want to see all of the ways in which it could be. So if I say, let me give you an example. Once we overcome inequalities and overcome scarcity and overcome limitations and borders and bigotry and hatred and all of that, and we'll be left with universal brotherhood. Okay, obviously, as you see already, there are a million assumptions built into this, but let's set those aside. We get to this state, and now I ask you, will there be rule or will there be no rule? Will there be the need for authority or will there be anarchy? Well, as it happens, it's helpful for us in thinking about that question to identify the assumption about human nature. Are we fundamentally good or are we fundamentally dangerous or evil? If we are essentially dangerous, then it would seem like there's never going to be at this stage just a rule-free anarchy. Because if we're dangerous, there's going to be a need for dominion. There's going to be a need for rule. So whether man even needs to be ruled somehow depends on whether you think man is by nature good or by nature evil, fundamentally good or evil. If you think man is evil, let's take that for example. Well, as Carl Schmitt in Strauss's response to Carl Schmitt indicated, there are two ways at least that you could think that a person is quote unquote evil. One way is you can say you're evil in the sense that you're like an animal who could in principle be tamed or educated. In other words, your evil is in some sense natural but can be overcome through the overcoming of nature. But there's another kind of evil which is like original sin evil, metaphysical evil, baked into your existence evil, not in a way that your education will overcome, but in a way that is there until the judgment day. Well, if how I think about rule, morality, law, the need for nations or the need for globalism is in some sense dependent on my understanding of the goodness or evil of the human being, then I'm in that domain. I can't help but raise the question. So what does that mean? Is there a benevolent creator of the world? Well, that'll have some effect on whether I'm fundamentally good or evil, and so on. So that's why, in my view, when you scratch the surface of what's implied in these political teachings, you see that they hang on some really questionable assumptions. And questioning those assumptions is what we call beginning to philosophize, thinking about what's implied in all of those positions. You can raise the question about justice, for example, like Plato does in the Republic. Somehow you think justice is self-evident, it's following the law, but then again, there can be unjust laws. So there's some standard of justice that we use to judge the laws themselves. Otherwise, we couldn't say there's an unjust law. Well, what is the nature of justice? Suddenly, that clearly is a question with some political relevance, but it also drives us past just politics narrowly construed, because you don't really know, like in the Republic, what justice is if you don't know what the soul is, if you don't know whether it's divided or whether it's unified. And so that is, to my mind, the key observation. I took it in the direction of Heidegger because of Heidegger's importance as a 20th century philosopher who got to the bottom of these questions. But in principle, you could begin asking these questions at any level of political analysis and go whichever way your questioning takes you. I think Plato is super helpful, but at any rate, that's the connection. Does that make sense? So punishment, what is the nature of crime, of responsibility, of law? Like, I'll give you an example. In Plato's Laws, Plato has a dialogue called the Laws. The very first question of the Laws. Now, if I ask you, the law, is that a political or a philosophical issue? Well, let's say that ordinarily we'd call it a political issue. Law, politics, okay, fine. Closer to politics than to philosophy. The very first question of Plato's Laws, the character called the Athenian stranger is talking to two old Greek men, and he says to them, "Who do you say gave you your laws, a man or a god?" And it's like, okay, we obviously are now in the relationship between politics, theology, and soon enough philosophy, even though the word philosophy is not all over that text like it is in the Republic. And that's just the domain that's opened up here.
I have had this question written down. I've been wanting to ask you this question. I didn't know how we were going to fit it into the conversation, but now I have my perfect opportunity. In your opinion, Dr. Michael Millerman, PhD, renegade philosopher, are there human rights without God?
Well, let me just say, okay, I try to speak for my understanding of the tradition of the history of political philosophy, mostly on the basis of Strauss as my teacher. I don't claim any originality on these key questions. On the Heidegger thing, I think I contributed something. But there's a reasonable teaching of the Hobbes variety, for example, that says there is a natural right that we have without God. Okay? So there are human rights without God. But we need to understand how those two things relate. Because it's not just there's no God and we happen to have these human rights. In Hobbes, to slightly overstate the case, because we want to ensure that people take their bearing not by duty but by right, we will dethrone God. We'll take God out of the equation so that people think about themselves in terms of rights. You see? In other words, somehow atheism and a rights doctrine in the history of political philosophy are related. So one of the ways that Hobbes develops this idea, in a nutshell, is that in the state of nature, in the state that we are in before the establishment of a political society, there is no divine support for human justice. In other words, there's no God who cares about human life and who ensures through a natural moral law our and through an eternal human soul, our conscience and well-being and well-doing. No, what you have instead is man is a wolf to man, a state of war that is solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And in this state of war, before the establishment of a civil society, there's something that is common to all of us and very strong in all of us: the fear of violent death. There's no law to protect us. There's no state to protect us. All we have is scarcity and desire. And I see that you can kill me. You don't see that I can kill you. But in this example, let's imagine it was me and my buddies, okay? And you saw that we could kill you. There's a fear of violent death. And Hobbes said that this is the bedrock of the new political philosophy that he was establishing, the bedrock of the new political science. Not man's excellence, not man's perfection, not his philosophical flourishing or something like in the classical teaching. That's too rare a thing. That depends on too many chance occurrences. Rather, let's base our political teaching on something universal, low, common, reliable, and secure: man's fear of violent death. What's the flip side of the fear of violent death, according to Hobbes? It is the desire for self-preservation, desire to live, and to live ultimately well and comfortably. So our natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, let's say, or our natural right to decide what we need to protect our own lives and to acquire what we need to feel safe and secure, is not a God-given right. It's a function of our godless first position, our being situated in a natural world of scarcity and brutality without any divine support. Strauss says that this teaching really lies at the basis of the development of liberal modernity. So human rights on one hand, and the rejection of God on the other. There are a few other aspects to this argument, a few other stages. So Hobbes had raised the question, well, some people who very much do believe in an afterlife and in justice and God and in morality, they're not afraid of death because they know that when they die, they will go to an afterlife where they will be rewarded for having lived well. So if I want to ensure the political teaching of universal human rights on the basis of fear of violent death and the flip side of it, desire for comfortable self-preservation, I must remove the thing that stops people from fearing death. I must remove their belief in an afterlife and in divine rewards and punishments for behavior. So once again, those two things are linked: human rights and an attack on theological principles, let's say.
So human rights presuppose the non-existence of God.
In their origin in the history of political philosophy, in Hobbes, Machiavelli, Locke, let's say, yeah, those two things. Because another thing Strauss brings out in his commentary that I find helpful, this isn't something that I'm expert in, but I'm going to restate it because I thought it was really helpful. He says that in the Christian teaching, the state of nature is, as it were, sandwiched between our life in paradise before the fall. Then we have the fall. That's our natural existence. And then we have our redemption, or a state of grace. But the modern philosophers, they rejected the Christian teaching of a pre-fall state, so they just ignore that. They call our state of nature not a punishment, but just our natural state. They define human nature in terms of its fallenness, but without the theological presupposition of fallenness. And they replace the state of grace with the establishment of civil society, with the establishment of the state somehow. You see, so these things have an anti-theological thrust built into them in a certain way. Now, there's another understanding of human dignity and of the worth of the human individual or the human soul that I think can be universal, and that doesn't depend on a rejection of God. But somehow I would say the modern notion of human, of natural right or of modern right, whether it knows it or not, whether it's explicit about it or not, if it recovers the presuppositions of its own tradition and its own history, I think it could be surprised to see, or not, the latent atheism there. I do think that because human beings are knowing beings or rational creatures independently of the doctrine of human rights, that human worth and human dignity is among other things, maybe first and foremost, a function of the fact that we can know, that we can understand, that we can think. And that doesn't require this foundation of a violent fear of violent death or desire for comfortable self-preservation or the acquisition of never-ending consumption, or whatever the case is with these modern thinkers. It just acknowledges that man's dignity consists in his ability to think and to understand. And as Strauss somewhere put it, this ability to be aware of your own progress in understanding, your thinking about your own thinking and taking satisfaction in your understanding, is so noble an experience that Aristotle could ascribe it to his God. And that the fact that the mind can do these things shows you that the universe is ultimately benevolent, because only in a benevolent universe would there be a place for the dignity and nobility of man's thought. And so that somehow, that's one way of thinking about the relationship of universal human dignity and godliness that is somehow distinct from the properly speaking modern view.
Yeah, I'm just trying to reconcile and triangulate the conversations I've had with you and with Dugin. Still can't believe that I talked to that guy and interviewed him. That was amazing. Talking to him, the notion of a universal liberalism, why he rejects that, where the notion of universal human rights comes from, its relationship to God, how sort of religious societies and cultures would reject these notions of universal rights, and just how it all plays together, because to me this seems to be a very fundamental issue, and Dugin really tackled it. So thank you for helping me sort of parse some of this. Do you have any more thoughts on that sort of web that I just put together there?
No, you're right. I mean, Dugin has a couple of reasons, a lot of reasons for rejecting universal liberalism. Somehow it is not true to man's nature, to the flourishing and blossoming complexity of the human existence. It's not open to the gods and to the divine and all of that. If it is, it has a very distorted or watered down interpretation of everything like that. So I think these thinkers, the true benefit of reading Dugin, Strauss, Heidegger, even Derrida, Rorty, is that they give us some access points to these questions and to these issues. After all, if we are ultimately exposed to the divine, to God, to the gods, to angels, however you want to think about it, right? If the human soul is open to the divine, but we live under a reigning orthodoxy or ideology that has blocked that from us, or that has substituted the true gods with some Disneyland alternatives. Nothing against, okay, I've never been there, I don't want to say, but you know what I mean? That has substituted it with some fake copy and not the real deal, then that is all important to us. So all of these thinkers, Heidegger, Dugin, Strauss in particular, I mean, Strauss said there's one question before the human being that stands above all other questions. What is the right way of life? And ultimately, we're faced with a fundamental alternative. It's the ability of the human being to know through his unassisted human reason, in other words, the philosophical life, or it's the life of obedience to divine revelation. The question whether there's a God, what God would be, is comprehensive and all important for thinking about who we are, where we've been, where we're going, the meaning of our history, of our past, present, and future. If Dugin didn't have anything valuable to say about that, he did because you interviewed him, but it's amazing how many people weren't sensitive to the fact that these have been decisive questions for him too, since his early days. And there are materials of his that are only available in Russian. Eventually I'll get around to translating them if I can, that are just profound inquiries into just these issues.
When you were talking about Derrida and Rorty, or maybe it was just Derrida, and you insinuated or said explicitly even that his philosophizing was politically motivated. It reminded me of Dugin and the question that I asked him directly myself too, which was, is his idea of a ethno-pluralism based on individual Dasein, unique experiences to each person, was that him backwards tracing his desire for a multipolar world, subsequent to the end of the Cold War, etc., or was it truly based bottom up, ground floor up philosophy? What do you think about that in this context of this entire discussion?
Dugin gives us reason to think in his writings that he is someone who has a strong political preference or commitment, let's say, to being Russian generally, and that he somehow is looking for intellectual resources to support that intuition or that hunch, and that he can find them in the most amazing places. He can draw on so many different traditions and disciplines and theories and approaches, and sort of put them all in the service, coincidentally, or sometimes it would seem like, of the defense of a separately already pre-existing political preference. I think it certainly can seem that way sometimes. That's not my view ultimately, though, of what he's doing. First, let me say, though, that there's a tradition in Christian thought of faith-seeking knowledge, where you have an intuition or an inclination or a belief, and then you are searching for the resources to make sense of it and to do apologetics for it and to get to the truth of it, to demonstrate for yourself the truth of it. So it's not like that's an ignoble pursuit or something like that. And if that's what he was doing, there would still be, I think, a great deal of value to his work. But on the basis of some passages, some key passages that I've read, and just these years of reading him and looking at his work, it's clear to me that, he says in one of his texts, he says, look, all talk about a Russian national idea, about Russian history or Russian destiny, and all conservative political projects in Russia, anti-liberal, conservative political projects, unless they have done a rigorous philosophical analysis that justifies this outlook, they're meaningless. They're free-floating creations or speculations for us. In other words, if his reading of Heidegger had showed genuinely that there's not an existential plurality of Daseins, or that the idea of a Russian existential uniqueness is bogus, I think that he would concede to the philosophy on behalf of the politics. You know what I mean? He wouldn't preserve the call for Russia's distinctness in the face of philosophical, sociological, anthropological, all of the disciplines that he draws on. If they all showed him that that was wrong, I think his commitment would be to the truth. That's my view. That's why I call him a philosophical supremacist. And I could be wrong, but my, it's not like I've done no work. I've read him and thought about him for a little while, and that's how it seems to me.
You're a bona fide expert. Don't be so humble, sir. All right, let me try to put this question together. We talked about Hobbes. We talked about the natural state of man, and implied latent atheism in there. Yeah. We talked about universal rights, the relationship to God. We talked about plurality of Daseins. What is the connection between a plurality of Daseins, God, and human rights? What is that relationship?
So for Dugin, it seems to be that we can't speak about one set of human rights because we can't speak about the human as such, as universal. You have to take into account the fundamental difference among human, how would you put it? For him, the difference of human types, but again, existential types, in the relationship of their being to language, you see this weird configuration, this existential philosophical configuration. That's where we would have to look to see how each people or each Dasein understands itself, understands its God, understands its relationship to being, and understands the difference between duties and rights and what's most important. So implied in any talk about human rights or implied in any talk about God is a lot of understanding about what exactly you mean by that, how you're interpreting that, what you're saying about it. But all of these acts of interpretation are a function of the thing that Heidegger called Dasein. And so if that's plural, then we just have the task of actually not rushing to assert the universality of human rights, but actually carefully demonstrating the distinctions of interpretation among the fundamental units or players, and only after that colossal work, seeing what's universal, what's common, what's shared. And Dugin has a 24-volume set of books called Noomachia, Wars of Nous, Wars of Intellect, where he tries to examine, and as he says, these 24-volume works, they could be like a table of contents for another 1,000 works, okay? Because this is literally somehow inexhaustible task to try to understand how all the different civilizations, as he sees them, or all the different traditions, think about the soul, God, the afterlife, the underworld, the beyond. Only it's very arrogant of us to assert universal human rights without having made the effort to understand what everybody means by human when they're talking about the human. We just collapse all of that into something self-evident when in fact that buries all the richness and spares us conveniently all the labor. He didn't write these 24 books, would be easier for him to say, everybody's got the same human rights, or no, nobody's got the same human rights. But when you actually have to think it through in a methodologically rigorous way on the basis of studying the right sources, and what does the poetry reveal about the understanding of the human being? What does the philosophy reveal? What does the literature reveal? And then he has a typology, in Noomachia, don't have to get into all of the details, but different types of world configuration, Apollonian, Dionysian, Sabellian. And so when you do all of that, you see that, wow, I just papered over huge questions by calling it all human rights. I just assumed that it's self-evident what it is to be human. That is a totally unphilosophical assumption, number one. It's methodologically inadequate assumption because it's like the thing that you're supposed to prove, you just assumed at the outset and considered your work done. And so he doesn't need to say there's no universal human rights. He only needs to say we won't know for sure until we have exhausted the interpretations of what it is to be human beyond our own self-understanding.
Well, was Heidegger a Christian?
Heidegger was initially a Christian. My understanding is that he was training to go into the priesthood, and he was doing commentaries on the phenomenology of Paul's texts and things like that. So he was bringing to light some themes from Christian thought. But by the time he comes around to, properly speaking, conversion to philosophy, I think he becomes, properly speaking, an atheist. So he has a Christian sort of prehistory and some themes that linger. But
Dugin's a Christian. He's an Orthodox, huh?
Yes, he identifies as old believer Russian Orthodox. And yet he has his own interpretation, of what that means to him. And sometimes it's just faithfulness to the tradition as inherited, and sometimes it's thinking it through on the basis of all of the conceptual apparatus that's available through these many disciplines. He's also willing to step outside of himself and identify with non-Orthodox, non-Christian positions. Like he said in his Noomachia series, when he was writing about America, he had to become an American. When he writes about Shia Islam, he becomes Shia Islam, because that is a type of sympathy, a type of, you have to be sort of totally sympathetic with the object of study in order to describe it from within. And he says that this operation of being true to your own identity at the same time as you're willing to go like an undercover spy so fully into the identity that you're trying to, another identity that you're trying to become indistinguishable from it, this is a very specialized operation. It's not something that everybody could pull off. As much specialized training as you would need to be an undercover spy, you need that plus much more in order to be able to do this type of hermeneutic operation. But that's how he writes. That's how he writes about himself. I know that there are some. I have heard, this isn't my bread and butter, but I have heard that there are some Christian, or including Russian Orthodox Christians, who consider his teachings heretical. But I think in general, if you combine this type of daring philosophizing with any religious tradition, it's always going to strike someone as heretical. He wants to be true to his inherited faith, which he thinks is true, and at the same time go full steam ahead into the dignity of philosophical life.
I'm trying to understand the relationship here between a Christian God, and I'm not Christian, and so I could be totally off on this, but my understanding is that part of the belief is that there's one true God, the Christian, and then if you take Heidegger's Dasein and then and extend it through Dugin into his plurality and ethno-plurality and Dasein plurality, what is the relationship between plurality and one true God? That was something that I'm having trouble squaring.
Yeah, so again, these aren't questions I would say that he closes, they're questions that he opens. But he says in his Heidegger book that Dasein, the word Dasein, it has two components. It has Da, which is sort of like the there or the localization or the being in a place of the human being. Okay, the Da is somehow localization, spatialization, or place. And Sein, which is being. So he says, if there's an existential plurality of Daseins, which of these two is the source of the plurality? Is it that there's one being, but many Das that differentiate existentially, like a prism, the light of being? Or is being itself plural? He raises those as hypotheses that he doesn't close or answer. He just opens them for exploration. So he does work on the basis sometimes of the thesis that what pluralizes Dasein existentially is Da, or the localization. And other times he tries to emphasize the distinction of being itself, like refracted through a prism or whatever the case is. So these are questions you see when we get into some methodological nuance like that he can still think about Christian God and the Christian world interpretation and theology in terms of these models, but it just requires some elaboration and some development. About how his thought intersects in different ways with Christianity, I can also say that he's written a lot about, in his Noomachia series and elsewhere, that there are Gnostic interpretations of Christianity, that there's this variety of Gnosticisms, and not a topic that I've looked at very closely, but some of Heidegger's inner circle of students, they went on to become scholars of Gnosticism. So you have their Christianity, Gnosticism, and Heidegger potentially resources for understanding one another. Then you have the existence of Neoplatonism and Neoplatonic mystical trends in Christianity, which is something else that you can think about together with Heidegger. So for him, this is a big experimental region, and it's not anything goes free for all, but you can begin to make connections. Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Heidegger, this interpretation of that interpretation of this, and start to get a version that is true to Christianity without sacrificing these other commitments, let's say, or theses or axioms that he has. Some of his early books, like I think his first book in Russian was called Metaphysics of the Gospel. I haven't worked on those texts. I will focus primarily on the Heidegger and on the Plato and some other things. But his Christian thought is another, I think, unexplored territory.
Well, I'm glad to hear that he as well consider these to be open questions, because I can't see right now any way to totally square those up. Obviously, I'm struck by the similarity, it seems, between Heidegger's Dasein and the impact of the localization on being, etc. And is it metaphysics, where like the observation of the subject actually changes the subject? It seems like there's a relationship there that I don't know enough about either one to flesh out. But trying to figure out, what is the authentic state of being without using a lens that's external seems like a universal sort of question if you look at it through physics and you look at it through philosophy.
Yeah, Heidegger, he teaches us even what it means for us to see something as external to ourselves. The obvious, everyday, naive view is that I am over here and this other thing is over there, away from me, separate from me, external to me. And he actually sees it slightly differently, because what he says is that when we interpret ourselves like that, we see ourselves as sort of like a self-contained point or something, wherein we are inside of our own bodies or something. Okay, we are in this, like, you see what I mean? There's this interpretation of ourselves as having an inwardness that's confined to our body or something. But he says that is actually not the basic. That is not the basic phenomenon. That the basic phenomenon is that the space around us, our being in a place, being in a space, the da of our Dasein, our localization, or the fact, to put it in some even more technical terminology here, that anything can arise for us in the first place, that we are always in a clearing. That's how anything could be there for us in the first place. It's not that first there was a clearing or a space in a place and then plop, we were put into it, and there's other stuff that's into it and we just happen to be at a distance from it. So here's us, here's this other thing, and we're both in a space. That's actually not how he sees it. And that he says is already a derivative interpretation of ourselves in the world, a distorted interpretation of ourselves in the world, that the more basic phenomenon is that we are always already constitutively, essentially, structurally, together with a clearing or a world or a space. We're not in it like water in a cup. It is us. We are a spatial, placed out, localized world together with being in. Being in the world is who we are. We're not a subject who happens to be or not to be in a world. This requires a shift in perspective. It really requires a sort of shift. But if under Heidegger's guidance, we at least consider it from that perspective, then we see that even being what's external and what's internal, we see that differently. Because if my existence includes or is essentially also this spatialization or localization, then I can't say that I am in here and the space is out there. I'm always outside of myself, in the world as part of myself, you see? So it's not supposed to be immediately obvious. It requires, like I said, a shift in perspective. But Heidegger says that's if you want to get down to the bottom of things, that's what you have to. That's what you have to do.
Shifting perspectives. I think that might be the theme of the whole book here, beginning with Heidegger. Tracing back the philosophical journey back to a misinterpretation that got doubled down, tripled down all the way through the years. And now Michael Millerman has taken the opportunity to go back to begin with Heidegger and to analyze 4 other philosophers who have done the same, their works, their relationships, to try to, what's it called when you have 4 things to triangulate? When you triangulate to get a bigger picture of Heidegger's influence and to really do, I think, an admirable job of parsing between the philosophy of the man and the politics of the man in Heidegger, which is something not everyone can do. So thank you very much for that, Michael. Is there some finishing or concluding thought that you'd like to leave us with? I have 10 more questions. I think we're going to do a series here, Michael. So I'm going to put my questions aside. What do you have something you want to leave us with? What was your conclusion? How do you feel now after having written the book? Where was your personal growth? What is the wrap up here? Take us home, Michael.
I would say I discovered for myself, and I discovered for the field that I was working in of political science and political theory, that an overzealous commitment to liberalism had left some pearls of great price of philosophical thinking out of purview, out of the picture. And if you think that something about man's dignity stands in relation to our ability to think deeply about the most fundamental things, then you have to recover what was lost. That puts any responsible citizen before the question about the relationship between what's required of our intellectual lives and what's required of our moral and political lives. And there I find Leo Strauss to be even more helpful than Heidegger, even though it's through Heidegger that we recover that lost gem.
Fantastic. Michael, thank you so much. Guys, check it out. Check out the book, Beginning with Heidegger. I have it right here. It is something that you should definitely read or listen also to our podcast that we did, Dugin, for Dummies. Definitely not for dummies in that case. Michael, you're teaching some classes right now. Where can they find you? How can people get more Michael Millerman?
michaelmillerman.ca. You find my videos, articles, essays. Contact me if you want private tutoring. Otherlife.co/Strauss is the site for the Introduction to Leo Strauss course I'm teaching, 8 weeks. We've had a first session, but it's not too late to register and get onto that if you'd like. If you Google me or search me up on YouTube, a lot of my lectures I've posted for free, a lot of my content on Strauss, Dugin, and Heidegger. I just share to introduce you to these thinkers, Carl Schmitt and others. So michaelmillerman.ca or Google me, and that's where you'll find my work.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you very much, Michael Millerman. I am Jack Murphy. This is Jack Murphy Live. You can follow me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. Follow me and subscribe, please, on youtube.com/Jack Murphy Live. Jack Murphy Live everywhere, guys. Thank you all so very much for joining us. We'll be back pretty soon with some great guests. But Michael, thank you. And, just keep on trucking, dude. We'll be talking again soon. I'm sure of it.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. And the theme music is back, guys.